A lot of people think Lake Turkana Wind Power Plant is in Turkana County, but it is not. When we say Turkana Wind, we're not referring to the lake, nor are we referring to the county Turkana. We are referring to the wind corridor that provides the wind energy that we are harnessing, and that's why we call it Lake Turkana Wind Power. There's absolutely no country in the world, zero, nada, no country in the world that is able to develop and transform itself and have world-class infrastructure, roads, rail, ports, airports, energy generation, have world-class facilities in healthcare, education, entertainment, with purely taxpayer-funded funding. For me at Vision 2030, what was most encouraging about Lake Turkana is that we had a group of people who wanted to do something difficult but that will change Kenya. Power purchase agreements were not invented in Kenya.
The Lake Turkana Wind Power project has put Kenya on the global map of big green energy producers. But it did not just happen. It also had its own fair share of controversies. Welcome to the Turbines of Marsabit, a podcast about Africa's largest wind farm. On this first episode, I speak to Mugo Kibati, who is the outgoing chairman of Lake Turkana Wind Power. Mugo needs no introduction in Kenya. He's been the founding director general of Vision 2030. He's also sat on various boards and been the CEO of several other companies. But today, he speaks about Lake Turkana Wind Power, where he's been chairman for about 10 years. Mugo, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Paul.
So the first time you visit Lake Turkana, on the ground, what do you find? How is the place like?
Well, the first time there was no Lake Turkana; it was just
the location.
It was just.
How is it like?
There were a few camels and goats in between massive rocks, very harsh terrain. Even just being able to stand there in that heat and that wind, you got to give it to the people who live there. They're very hardy, and the animals are very hardy. It's Paul, if you went there, I don't know whether you last a week. And then it's very remote, very remote from the rest of the country, So even to contemplate a project of this size, $1 billion at the time, of course, currency rates have changed over time, but at the time, it was a $1 billion project, the largest single foreign direct investment in Kenyan history, right? And you're wondering, how do we even transport equipment to this location? Where will people be housed? Engineers, technicians, where will they be housed? How do we harness? There's no road to this location. There's no airstrip to this location. There's no, the grid is 428 kilometers away, the national grid that we want to supply from this location. So yes, it was a daunting task. Also setting up, people forget that setting up the management team to run those operations and making sure that we move from sort of a startup into a solid organization led by a competent management team, sourced both locally, from the area as well as from across the country. We set up, we began with a lot of expatriates, and over time, more and more Kenyans now are in total control of Lake Turkana. Yeah. If you look at the management team today, we do have an expert CEO, but the rest of the management team is competent Kenyans. Yeah. So having achieved all those various components of building an institution that is serving this country and putting Kenya on the global renewable energy map is the reason why I enjoyed serving as chairman of Lake Turkana.
Yes, and you've done a lot. This is Africa's largest wind farm, and arguably the most significant single investment by a private sector in this country. I mean, let us go back to the very beginning because we really would love to appreciate what really happened at the very beginning. Before you say, let there be wind, how do you decide that this is a location? How did you decide that Lake Turkana Wind will be located in Marsabit County, where it is today?
I think it's a confluence of factors. First, just to clarify, because a lot of people think Lake Turkana Wind Power Plant is in Turkana County, but it is not, right? Because the lake, the Jade Sea, what was in colonial times referred to as Lake Rudolph, which is Lake Turkana, the western shores of it is Turkana County. The eastern shores of that lake is Marsabit County. A lot of people don't know, unless young people who are studying geography might know that. And when we talk about Lake Turkana wind, we are talking about the wind corridor that runs across that lake between between some of the mountains in that area, which is famously known as the Lake Turkana Wind Corridor. And it runs across that lake on both sides, the Turkana County side as well as the Marsabit County side. And so when we say Turkana wind, we're not referring to the lake, nor are we referring to the county Turkana. We are referring to the wind corridor that provides the wind energy that we are harnessing. Yeah. And that's why we call it Lake Turkana Wind Power, which just happens to be located on the eastern shores of Lake Turkana in Marsabit County in a place called Loiyangalani. Right. Yeah. So the location, just going to your question, why that particular location? Because that is where Lake Turkana Wind Corridor is. Of course, the lake is part of the ecosystem that gives rise to that wind corridor, which has powerful winds, And the location of Loiyangalani was, after a lot of geo tests, found to be one of the places where you can most efficiently harness the wind energy. Yeah. And what happened way back in 1985, I was still a young boy then in high school. Yeah. A gentleman by the name of William Dolleman was fishing, a Dutch gentleman, and he felt the wind and wondered whether this wind could be harnessed for power. And I say this because I think it's important to understand that, significant projects of this nature don't come about easily, because though he first had that notion way back in 1985, it wasn't until 20 years later, in the mid-2000s, that actual efforts to begin to work on that project started. And that was because while you have the entrepreneur or the thinker who thinks up the idea or the notion, the people who actually bring it to fruition may be a different set of people with different skill sets. You also need to make sure that the policy environment also allows or supports that kind of a project. 1985, we weren't thinking about wind energy projects in Kenya as a policy, right? But by 2005, 2006, 2007, the energy sector and the policymakers of the energy sector began, following global trends to see whether we could harness wind energy at a global level. Remember, we had at the time we had the MDGs, which subsequently became the SDGs, which we're trying to implement today. Globally, the movement towards addressing climate, the impact of climate change on our planet, had picked up steam by 2005, 6, and 7, and therefore our policymakers in Kenya had begun to incorporate renewable energy into the policy framework of developing energy. And so it's a combination of all this, the entrepreneurs, the policy making, coming to meeting and deciding, okay, let's now try and get this project off the ground.
I mean, that must have been a big dream at the time, looking at the environment as it were. You are dealing with a situation whereby wind had not really, the most successful plant had been about 25 megawatts. And here you are dreaming of 310 megawatts. This is nearly 40% of what was installed capacity then. If I remember, it was about 900 megawatts. And here you are coming with 300 megawatts. This must have been a big dream.
Well, speaking of big dreams and confluence of factors, including policy and entrepreneurship coming together, remember that at the time, this project began around, the thinking and entrepreneurship around this project began in the mid-2000s. By 2008 actually, we had launched Vision 2030, which is not just a dream on energy or wind, it's a dream for transforming this country. Transforming this country into a middle-income nation in which the majority, if not all, citizens enjoy a prosperous life, meaning access to all essential services for themselves and their families, education, healthcare, and living in a clean environment, and having a decent living. And as part of that Vision 2030 dream was to grow the economy. Growing the economy was critical. And to grow the economy, it is, infrastructure is a critical backbone of growing any economy. And you can break infrastructure into two broad parts. One is how you get things, goods and services, from place to place. But the other is energy, the energy that drives manufacturing, that drives everything that you need in an economy. Energy is a very fundamental element. And as we were thinking about how much energy this country would require, at the time we had 900 megawatts, we knew that to grow to the level Vision 2030 envisaged by 2030, we would need a lot more energy generation. Combined with the fact that the world, with climate change, needed more renewable energy. So we had to think about growing our energy needs without destroying the environment or without exacerbating the climate change issue by going into things such as wind, solar, geothermal energy, and going big. 25 megawatts wouldn't cut it.
Yeah.
If we were going to be a middle-income country by 2030, when we expected at the time we were projecting there'd be 60 million people in 2030, and I think we're heading, it's pretty accurate, and we want an average per capita income of about $4,000, you're talking about a $240 billion GDP economy. At the time, we were less than $50 billion. So if you're going to grow sixfold, then your energy has to grow significantly. And if that growth is going to be driven by manufacturing, you need a lot of energy. And if you need all kind of energy, you must make sure you don't grow on diesel fuel-powered plants for a couple of reasons. One is that they're expensive. It's extremely expensive to run your energy on diesel power plants. But two, you're destroying the environment.
Yeah.
And so we had to think about wind, solar, geothermal differently. We had to think about big projects. And therefore, Lake Turkana, when the idea of Lake Turkana was presented, I think the policy-making fraternity was like, hey, wait a minute, let's support this project. So Kenya government decided, as part of Vision 2030, we need to support and encourage projects of this nature. And so the Ministry of Energy then, working with the promoters of the project, which included the original Willem Dolleman, Carlo van Wagenen, decided to start strategizing, laying a plan, raising funds for it, identifying the location, right? Securing the land, which was then held by the Marsabit County Council. It's 150,000 acres. It's a large project. And the good thing about locations which people see as remote, where you need huge tracts of land, is that Marsabit County, by this, is the largest county in the country.
Yeah.
So getting 140,000 acres in Marsabit County, which you apply towards a project such as solar or wind, land which people think is barren, you can't really grow much, so it appears useless. But for this particular kind of deed or requirement, it's very useful, especially because the Lake Turkana Wind Corridor runs across there. And so the size of the project was determined because the country needed that level of project. So it took some gumption, frankly speaking. And there were doubters. There were people who doubted our ability to do this.
Yes, let's go there because here you are looking at literally a dream. I mean, we have tried and tested. People have seen diesel generators. We have hydro. There's geothermal. And then here you're looking at wind, which in many respects has been seen as not very stable. Sometimes it has, there are a lot of other factors that are involved. How do you get convinced before you even start selling this wind idea that this can actually be a project? There must be people who told you, no, this is not going to work.
No, absolutely. And look, by its own intrinsic definition, renewable, anything renewable means that you use it and reuse it. That's why it's renewable. And because of that, there's elements of you're using it, it's used up, you need time for it to regenerate and come back, which is why you're saying, unlike diesel-generated power plants, or nuclear power plants, which can be constant 24/7, renewable energy power plants, whether they be wind or solar, right, can be 24. They cannot be 24/7. I mean, solar, you're using the sun, the 12 hours you have the sun, right? Wind, you're using the wind when the wind is at its best, but wind goes up and down. And so it has taken many, many years to come to the level of technological development that we are at today to be able to harness renewable energy sources such as wind and solar. And it improves every year. But it is an effort that humanity has been keen on because of the gentle impact that renewable energy sources have on the planet, right? Vis-a-vis what diesel and fuel does to the planet. So in this country, we have been lucky because we have geothermal, and geothermal is a green energy source that is 24/7, but it's a perishable. You have a finite source. Hopefully, it will take many, many, many decades before we can be able to expand to finish the capacity of geothermal we have in this country. But the thing about wind and solar, it will always be available once we get to the level of technological, especially storage. Storage has been the challenge. How do you store renewable energy such that when you have the sun, when you have the wind, you're able to have the capacity stored, and so that you can utilize it even when the wind or the sun is not there. And we're heading. We're much better off today than we were 20 years ago. Right? It keeps improving. The cost of renewable energy initially was very high, but it has been going down over time with the improvement of technology. So in 2008, 9, 10, when this project was going through the approval process by the Ministry of Energy, if you look at Lake Turkana specifically, at that time, the tariff that was stipulated by the Ministry of Energy was 12 US cents per kilowatt hour for wind. You compare that with what the diesel fraternity was charging, upwards of 25 cents, 26 cents, right? So 12 US cents was the tariff that was set for wind. And Lake Turkana was able to come to 8.7 US cents. So actually, the tariff that was approved for Lake Turkana was below what their formal official tariff of 12 US cents was, because they could have said, look, we want to do 11.5 cents because government allows 11.5 cents if they were greedy, but they did not. I think you had the kind of also entrepreneurs and investors who are interested not in making huge profits, but making a decent return and getting a project delivered at affordable prices for Kenyans.
So is there a feasibility study that is being done at this time? How is it like? How do you decide that this wind is strong enough? I mean,
absolutely. They are not just you have to have many studies. You have to have the geological studies, the energy studies, the studies about understanding how wind is harnessed. You need very complex engineering. We had wind engineers from Denmark who are doing this. Vestas was a big part of the early feasibility studies of this project, and understanding the viability. First of all, you have to say, is it viable? Then is it bankable? And if it's bankable, is it sustainable? And a project has to be self-sustaining. And I think there's one point I'd like to make to my fellow citizens and Kenyans is that when we say we want private sector as opposed to government to drive as many projects as possible, and people tend to think, oh, but private sector, they're just going to go for profits and they're greedy. The challenge is you want any project that you start in Kenya or anywhere in the world today is 2024, you want it to be thriving in 2084.
Yeah.
Right? The challenge is when you have public sector projects which are taxpayer funded, right? Then you don't have the incentive sometimes because policy changes, administrations change, people get wary of paying taxes. But when you have a self-sustaining, profitable project, you want that because you're guaranteeing that the project by itself will justify to investors to continue sustaining itself. So sustenance is enhanced when you have a project that has got returns that enable one, the project to be able to continue paying for itself, and two, future growth, future expansion for that project. So, and therefore, when you look at the Ministry of Energy, they had a least cost power plan, right? A plan that said we're at 900 megawatts today, we need to be at about 20,000 megawatts in 2030, and this is the path by which we're going to grow, and it includes a mixture of renewables and non-renewables, but as we progress, we want more renewables. And in the renewables component, we have solar, we have wind, we have geothermal, right? And Lake Turkana fit into the wind component part of it. And so by the time it was being approved by the Ministry of Energy, it was clearly a part of Kenya's overall least cost power plan.
Yeah. So you're moving now from Vision 2030 and sitting at Lake Turkana Wind as its chairman. All this has happened 20 years. There has been some work that has been put in. What is the mood like at that point? What are you finding?
So let me say this, because I think it's important. It's not that I'm moving from Vision 2030 to Lake Turkana. It's that while I was in Vision 2030, my objective was to see Kenya transformed. And clearly energy was an important component of transforming Kenya, of driving the manufacturing and the industries that will transform this country. And so we had a lot of projects under Vision 2030, many of them government-driven, such as the geothermal projects, which were under KenGen and the Geothermal Development Corporation. We had hydro power plants, which from the very beginning of the power sector in this country, we've had hydro projects. And we were now beginning, and then we had, unfortunately, a lot of diesel-powered power plants, which really arose from the power issues we had in the early to mid and late 90s, where emergency power plants, which were diesel-driven, eventually became permanent, and we began commissioning diesel-driven power plants. And diesel-driven power plants, they have their place. Okay, they have their place as long as you have the right mix. When they become a majority of or a significant portion of power production, it becomes too expensive. The power becomes too expensive. So it was important to reduce a component of diesel fuel power plants. And so our role at Vision 2030, which was to basically monitor, coordinate, and ensure that all the various actors are doing their bits and pieces. As we engage the Ministry of Energy, they would drive. Basically, it was a Ministry of Energy objective. And we would actually sit down with the Ministry of Energy and say, look, we need X megawatts by 2012. We need another 3X megawatts by 2017. How are you going to do it? And the Ministry of Energy would go and come back and tell us we're going to have, an additional 1,000 megawatts, and these are the components of it. 300 will be wind, 300 will be solar, 300 might be geothermal. And you say, fine, now you give us a plan of how you intend to implement that, right? And by the way, don't ask us for too much money, because obviously at Vision 2030, I had the role of ensuring that we implement this massive, large infrastructure or social project with very little taxpayer money. Hence the need for private sector participation, the need for PPPs. So we would ask the Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Roads, Ministry of Kenya Railways, okay, you've got this project, you need several billions, but we don't have that much money at the National Treasury. How are you incorporating private sector? And they would go and do their thing and come back and say, oh, we have a number of PPP. Now, in the case of Ministry of Energy, I can't tell you for sure when, but at some point, I think in the late 90s, a decision was made that government will not be the only generator of power. There was a time when, KenGen and its precursor, KPLC was KenGen was hived out of KPLC, Kenya Power Lighting Company, was the 100% generator of power. A decision was made in the late 90s that we now want to encourage private sector participation, and therefore power purchase agreements were developed. And people, different generators began signing power purchase agreements with Kenya Power Lighting Company, where Kenya Power Lighting Company is able to source energy from not just KenGen, but from independent power producers. I think you've had IPPs. That has become very topical of late.
Yes.
The challenge I think we have had, and I must say this, is that power purchase agreements were not invented in Kenya. It's a global phenomenon, standard. And there is no reason why to this day we have not yet standardized power purchase agreements such that, you go to the Ministry of Energy, it's almost like a template. You want wind, here's a PPA. You want to do solar, here's a PPA. The tariff is X, and these are the payment. This is the payment structure that you're going to follow. But in any case, it's been done ad hoc. But the notion of power purchase agreements is a global standard, which is why when Lake Turkana Wind Power project started, for instance, the entrepreneurs knew that they have to get a power purchase agreement. And that comes from the Ministry of Energy and Kenya Power Lighting Company. On the part of Kenya Power Lighting Company and Ministry of Energy, they have to make sure that these people who are asking for a PPA know what they're doing, and there's a bankable project for them to issue the PPA. It's also catch-22. Without the PPA, the promoters cannot be able to raise funds because the people who are going to pay or give you money to develop the project need to see that you have a contract, typically a 20-year contract. Who is the off-taker? The off-taker is KPLC. Do they have the wherewithal and ability to support, in this particular case, a 310 megawatt power project over those 20 years? Yes. If they do, fine. We think we might want to invest. And I think this is where, Paul, I have to talk about the fundraising for Lake Turkana Wind Power.
Just before we get into fundraising, because you raised an important issue of PPP and public partnership projects.
Yes.
Have not had a very good ring in the minds of many Kenyans.
Yes.
When Kenyans hear PPP, they feel there's a scandal or there's something. Yet this, according to Vision 2030, as you rightly said, was something that was supposed to be really considered for big infrastructure projects. What is the disconnect?
Look, I think we have our own local challenges in this country. There's absolutely no country in the world, zero, nada, no country in the world that is able to develop and transform itself and have world-class infrastructure, roads, rail, ports, airports, energy generation, have world-class facilities in healthcare, education, entertainment, with purely taxpayer-funded funding. Never. Not even what some people may consider communist countries like China. If you take two extremes of economic models, on one extreme you'd have the US as being a capitalist, free market, almost purely private sector driven projects. On the other extreme you'd have the communist China, where a government controls and funds everything. But even if you take China itself, way back in 1979, after the era of Mao Zedong ended and Deng Xiaoping took over power, they realized after nearly 30 years of Mao that they needed to move, they needed private capital to be able to help that economy grow. Yeah. If you went to Beijing, to China in 1979, it was a little hovel, right? And so what did Deng Xiaoping did? He looked at a neighbor, small little country called Singapore, under a gentleman called Lee Kuan Yew, and he invited Singapore to come and help them set up special economic zones for private sector investment. And that is where SEZ, special economic zones like Shenzhen and Guangzhou, were built in the 1980s in communist China with purely private sector investment. And that is why the China you see today has developed so much. You go to countries like Dubai and all. So in this country, much like every other country, we can't run away from the fact that if we want to transform into a middle and upper middle income country with the kind of facilities and infrastructure we need to have private sector participation. Taxes, as we've learned in the recent past, how high will you raise taxes? And they will never be enough to give you what you need, right? Yeah. If you look at just Nairobi, for instance, just look at healthcare facilities. If you're only going to depend on public sector ones, in Nairobi, without the support of private sector hospitals, for instance, you don't have the kind of healthcare that we have in this country. And that's just a small component of development. So we need to be more transparent in the way we undertake private-public partnership projects. As I said earlier on, standard templates. I ask the question, if it's power purchase agreements, right? Why does each have to be negotiated individually? Okay? Wind is wind. Solar is solar. The Ministry of Energy should have templates for wind, templates for solar, templates for geothermal. So if you want to come and do geothermal, there's a template the whole public knows what that template looks like. And therefore, that level of transparency, I think, would dispel some of the notions or the fears people have. Because to be fair, we have had corruption in this country. We have had powerful individuals in the past who are policymakers who are supposed to be ensuring transparency. But when Kenya decided to move into private into PPPs, took advantage of their positions, right? To participate directly in those kinds of projects. And therefore, Kenyans have now, sort of become suspicious, even of legitimate projects, even such as the Turkana Wind Power, And that has been the challenge. But the thing is, Paul, countries, Kenya 150 years ago, whichever part of Kenya, there are people who came to this country and said, they're marauding warlike tribes. How do we even get from Mombasa to the Pearl of Africa, to Uganda? Yeah. Well, you look at what was being seen as territory with warlike marauding tribes. Now, Nairobi stands there. Yeah. Right? So one has to say, if we're going to transform this country, we must transform every part of the country. We cannot leave certain parts of the country out. And I think, just harking back to my vision 20, 30 days, people never understood why the LAPSET project was so critical and so close to the heart of the late Mwai Kibaki. It is because the northern part of this country, 2/3, has been left out of the socio-economic fabric of this country since independence. Everything that we have done has been along, mostly about within 100 to 200 kilometers of the railway line that was built way back, 1895 to 1901 by the British. And at the time it was built, it was known as the Lunatic Express because it was so costly. And I think Kenyans need to read their history. They need to understand when the railway line was built by the British in 1895 to 1901, there was a parliamentary hearing in the House of Commons about the cost overruns, the ridiculously expensive and costly project in Kenya by the British. Yeah. That is long before the Kenyans who are now running government that people like, Kenyans like to pillory. Yeah. So this notion of cost overruns, and I'm not encouraging it, but it's not unique to Kenyans. Okay? Yeah. And look at now the fruits that Lunatic Express has borne. Mombasa has grown, and Machakos, and Nairobi, and Naivasha, and Nakuru, and Kitale, and Kisumu, because all those are along that railway line. And so by the time President Kibaki came to power, he was very keen that we do something about the northern part of Kenya. And there was a realization that you have to drive demand. It has to be a supply driven. You cannot say, when they need a railway line, we shall build it. When they need a port in Lamu, we shall build it. No. We have to say, we have to force development by saying we're going to put up a port in Lamu. We're going to invite our neighbors, South Sudan and Ethiopia, to use that port in Lamu, which will force us to build highways and railways through that terrain towards South Sudan via Turkana, towards Ethiopia via, Moyale, so that development can start and therefore socioeconomic activity can begin to be engendered. And so for me at Vision 2030, what was most encouraging about Lake Turkana is that we had a group of people who wanted to do something difficult but that will change Kenya. The one saying, I want to go to Malindi, it's a nice coastal holiday resorting type of area and put up a solar plant there. That's easy, or to go to Mombasa. And to be fair, I love the Ngong Hills power plant, but it's just next to Nairobi. It's a nice area to live in, right? But for someone to come and say, ever heard of Mount Kulal? Most people have never heard of Mount Kulal.
Yeah.
Huh? It is somewhere in a place called Loiyangalani. There's nothing there. But we want to put up the biggest power plant on this continent there. And you've got to say, that should be encouraged. That's the kind of thing that will transform Marsabit and encourage other people to say, wait a minute, if it can be done in Loiyangalani, why not in Adapal? Why not? Why not in Mandera? Why not in Garissa? Why not in other parts of Marsabit?
Yes.
But if we allowed these entrepreneurs who are attempting the near impossible to fail, then the message you would have sent to any other would-be entrepreneurs or people who would like to undertake projects is that you come to Kenya, it can't work in Kenya. And this is where, I felt and we felt that the World Bank's view that this project cannot succeed simply because nothing like this has ever been done before in a country like Kenya. And by the way, it's in such a remote part of Kenya. There's nothing there. So forget about it because there's nothing there. All the more the reason that we felt we have to get something done there. Yeah. And that is why when the promoters of, the likes of Carlo came to the Ministry of Energy and they were able to, the Ministry of Energy was like, wait a minute, if you guys can do that, why not, right? And when they got their PPA and they had secured the land and they had begun securing financing, by the time Vision 2030 got to meet the Lake Turkana promoters, they had already secured the land, they had secured their PPA, and they were now beginning to make strides at fundraising. We felt, this is what we need to encourage because, going back to Vision 2030, we had very many flagship projects, But the flagship projects we had were all government flagship projects. And I was concerned that Kenyans may begin to think that any big project in this country must be done by government. So we had Thika Highway, for instance. We were just beginning to do Thika Highway. Kenyans were excited about Thika Highway. It was a flagship project under Vision 2030. We were doing the Isiolo Moyale Highway as a flagship project. We're doing a number of flagship projects, right? Lamu Port was being done as a flagship project. Konza was being done as a flagship project. But these were government projects. And it was clear to us that government projects will not transform this country. We need private sector projects. So we began to identify people who had, credible, there are a lot of quacks who come along, but we began to identify credible, bankable, privately driven projects and to highlight them, to encourage people, others, to do the same. So Tatu City, as an example, Tatu City was the first serious, credible, bankable attempt at creating a planned development of a city of that scale with an industrial sector, residential sector, commercial sector, with highways in between. So we made that a flagship project. And we said, look, this is a private sector flagship project. Yeah. And we want people to see that this is a vision, this is part of Vision 2030. Yeah. And we need more of this, right? We went to Mombasa and I saw what they were doing at English Point. So we said, this will be the first marina, right, between Cape Town and Cairo.
Yeah.
we need Marina. So English Point Marina, the only of its kind on this part of the world, became a flagship project. And so similarly, Lake Turkana Wind Power, having secured their PPA, having secured the land, having clear plans, and now going quite far in fundraising, we also said, you know what? And it's in the northern part
of Kenya,
where nobody wants to do anything. We really wanted to highlight Lake Turkana project as a case in point of the kind of projects that will transform the northern part of Kenya. So we made it a flagship project of Vision 2030. And that's the reason why we did that.
Why would you be leaving when everybody is looking for a job?
Well, as chairman of Lake Turkana, the term job doesn't really fit in. First of all, let me make it very clear that I am non-executive, or I have been non-executive. It is not, my real job, my day job is as chief executive, where I work at Telkom Kenya. But where I sit on boards, it's generally because I believe in what those companies are delivering to society. And that is why, if you look at the profile of boards I've sat on, especially where I have been chairman, there have been companies or initiatives that are transformational. And it's the legacy that I am creating as chairman that drives me. And so after 10 years in Lake Turkana, I feel that we have achieved what we set out to do. Really, my task was to make sure that what was then seen as a complex, near impossible initiative or project in a remote part of Kenya, in Marsabit, has now successfully been, we've broken ground, gone through several challenges to commissioning to a point where today Lake Turkana Wind Power supplies at least a sixth, sometimes 20%, 50 to 20% of Kenya's total energy needs, and does it from a renewable source. So Lake Turkana has been a major part of making Kenya's energy sources renewable. Kenya is famed for being over 80% renewable energy. Lake Turkana is a major contributor to that. Yeah. So it is that legacy that drives me.
That has been Mugo Kibati, the outgoing chairman of Lake Turkana Wind Power. Mugo has told us how it was at the beginning. He's also told us why it's called Lake Turkana Wind Power, yet it sits in Marsabit County. Mugo has discussed the importance of PPPs in putting together such a big project. That's all the time we had for you on this first episode of the Turbines of Marsabit. In the next episode, we'll be looking at why the World Bank decision to pull out of this project nearly killed Kenya's dream to build Africa's largest wind farm. I'm your host, Paul Wafuda.